Hello, you gorgeous teacher. Welcome to Everything EFL. If you're one of my lovely regular listeners, welcome back. If you're a brand new listener, you are most welcome. I hope you stick around. Perhaps the name of this episode attracted you. I'm, of course, talking about Dylan Gates. Dylan is an experienced ELT professional with a Delta and a Master's in Applied Linguistics. He's worked as a Director of Studies, a teacher trainer, an examiner, and a course designer in the UK, Ecuador, and Spain. He's passionate about promoting learner-centered language teaching and is a fan of Dogme and Teaching Unplugged. And if you're not sure what that is, don't worry, we'll explain all. His teaching mantra is that learners are a teacher's greatest resource. Enjoy! I'm Erin O'Byrne and welcome to Everything EFL podcast. I'm passionate about serving teachers and I offer training for schools and institutions whose language teachers need a little refresher, a change of mindset and some super practical ideas to put into their classrooms straight away. There is no one-size-fits-all lesson plan, but you've got a friend and support system in me. I can help reduce your overwhelm, give you some teacher inspiration, and improve your work-life balance. How? With some solid advice, takeaways you can try out immediately, and some much-needed teacher love, because your well-being is important too. Are you ready to make small changes one step at a time and remember how amazing you are? Let's go. Dylan Gates, welcome to Everything EFL.
Thank you. It's great to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
Oh, it's a pleasure to have you. So let's get stuck in. So in a nutshell, what is dogma for anybody who doesn't know?
Right. Well, I often call it dogme, but I think it's supposed to be pronounced dogma, which is why I prefer to call it Teaching Unplugged. It's just easier to say. Well, it's based on three key principles. So the first one is teaching should be conversation driven. Although Scott Thornbury and who along with Luke Meddings they wrote the book called Teaching Unplugged. Originally, he just said it was conversation driven. But since then, because of technology, basically, and the fact that we use text so much nowadays to write, he suggests it should be called text driven. But that includes oral and written text. So speaking and writing in a communicative, conversational way, basically. So that's the first one. The second principle, it's materials light. You know, the idea that there's just too much stuff we use in the classroom, course books, apps, games, resources, whatever they might be. And the third principle is we should focus on emergent language.
Okay. And just for people who aren't sure what emergent language is, could you give a quick definition there?
Right. Well, people might be familiar with the term target language. So let's say, for example, I've decided to teach a class and my aim is that by the end of the class, the learners will be able to use the present perfect to talk about life experiences. So that's target language. I've got a specific language point that I want them to be able to understand and use by the end of the lesson. So emergent language is basically the opposite. It's where you say, I don't have any pre-selected linguistic grammar or vocabulary items I want to teach and I want them to use, but I'm going to communicate with them in some way and we'll see what happens. We'll see what language they have available to them and see what language emerges, arises, comes through the interaction.
Excellent. And I think just a really simple example of that would be something that popped up actually in my B2 class a couple of weeks ago. We did little mini dialogue rotations and one of them wrote, I don't have enough money, and I elevated it to, I can't afford it. So you're giving
Absolutely.
them more natural kind of spoken speech. And that's what I always say to them. You know, we're making changes. I'm giving you a more natural way of saying it for conversation.
Exactly. And when we're dealing with emergent language, that can come from the teacher, of course, you know, which lots of people call it kind of upgrading or extending. It can come, of course, from the learners. Yeah. You might have one group and one learner in the group has said this really great phrase like, I can't afford it. And you think, okay, we can share that with the rest. So emergent language can come from anyone in the interaction in the classroom.
Yeah, it's all about kind of elevating, isn't it, the language to something more natural, which I absolutely love. Now, the whole thing to me sounds amazing and I'm really into it, but I can imagine some teachers listening to this, like clutching their hands in horror going, what do you mean? Where's the course book? Where does the grammar, where's that? What would you say to those teachers?
Well, I'm lucky in that the teaching I do, it's mainly with adults, they're business professionals. So I don't necessarily have to follow a grammar syllabus. But I know that probably, I don't know, 80% of teachers, they probably got their grammar syllabus, the key lexis they want to also focus on. So I think we all know that we're all working in different teaching contexts and we've only got so much freedom. Some people have lots of freedom, other people don't. But we can find these dogma moments. See, these little moments where either you start talking about something and you realize the student's really engaged. So this is where you can take out some of that language and extract some of that useful language. Or you find it in, for example, if you're doing a PPP type lesson, you've got the presentation, practice, production. In the production, you'll have a lot of emergent language anyway. So even though you might be focused on getting them to use the present perfect simple for life experiences, stuff will emerge as well. So as long as you're very attentive and noticing that, then you can actually bring that to the attention of all of the learners. So I think it's about finding as much space as you can for this natural conversational communicative language that happens naturally.
Yeah. And it's not just about, like, I think a lot of times with monitoring, teachers focus on, what mistakes are they making? But what about noting down what they're saying and then, like you say, elevating it, giving them a natural alternative?
Exactly. I came across this idea the other day, which was user, which is U for upgrade. So can you upgrade the language? So for example, maybe an advanced learner said the word rich and you think, the word wealthy could be really useful here. Mm-hmm. So you're upgrading it. Then you've got S, which is for sharing. So maybe in a group, one learner uses the word wealthy and you think, okay, let's make sure all of the learners get this. So you can board it and go through it and so on. E is to extend or expand. So, this could be, you've got the word rich and then you think, okay, well, riches, you can expand, the word riches, or you can say, well, rich also applies to food. So you're drawing these connections here. And then R, which was reformulate. So we do this all the time as teachers. Learners even do it with each other, but thinking, okay, that student said he is very rich man. He is a very rich man, whatever it is. But we can reformulate. We can just improve it, tweak it a little bit.
I think that you could do this at any level.
Absolutely.
Do you agree?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And often it's what you said, just making something seem more natural. It might be the wrong register. It might be too formal. And you think, they're having a conversation here. Maybe this word would be more natural.
Yeah.
In a freer conversation.
Yeah. And I think also at lower levels, this is perfect because I remember when I had a beginner class last year and we all went around, they said, my name is, and without fail, every single one of them said, I in Dublin 3 weeks. Oh, brilliant. So I've been in Dublin and okay, they're probably not going to see that grammar for another, 6 months, but it's a brilliant sentence. They all need it. And you don't have to go into the grammar of it. It's just learn it as a phrase, which is for me perfect because I love the lexical approach.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And, getting them sort of trained early to focus on these lexical chunks or whatever you want to call them and just getting them to realize, I've got 3 or 4 words here that maybe I can use in other situations, I have been or whatever it is. Yeah, I think, at the end of the day, they're not necessarily going to acquire this language. They're not necessarily going to learn it, but they're going to get exposed to it. And it's all useful exposure. It's all useful input for them, I think.
Now, if someone, like you say, the 80% of teachers who are probably listening do have to use a syllabus that's probably more grammar heavy than we all would like, could you give them any advice there?
Yeah, well, I mean, if we go back to the PPP, presentation, practice, production, often the presentation takes way too long. And then you have a bit of time in the practice and the production is something that's left over at the end almost. So invariably teachers run out of time. Not always, but it happens a lot. So, I mean, one simple thing you can experiment with is starting with the production. So you think, okay, what is this communicative activity at the end? Let's see how they do with it. And it might be that the learners have already come across this particular structure, so they don't need to go through the presentation or you don't need to go through in so much detail. So that's something you're still covering that particular grammar structure, but maybe first of all, you're working from where they already are. So you're not assuming they've never come across it before. They have no knowledge of it. And also, they probably maybe they don't use it perfectly, but then you can do a bit of input to just tweak it and to fine tune what they already know. And then you can have another production task at the end. So you're giving them more freer practice production opportunities with that particular structure or lexical items or whatever it is. So I think that's one thing teachers can do.
Yeah, I try to implement like lots of institutionalized phrases at the production stage or even like at the review stage. And again, just thinking of the present perfect, there are so many institutionalized phrases, aren't there? I've never blanked before. It's the blankiest blank I've ever blanked. There are so many of them. You could spend a week on it. But I don't think anybody would want to spend a week on the present perfect.
No, imagine that, God.
Can you give like a couple of examples of to practically implement this in a class? Could you give me like an example of a typical class that you would conduct, for example, how you'd begin it?
I mean, there are loads of ways to do it, but I think we need to get their attention at the beginning. We need to think, okay, you've got to activate their interest and engage them. And there are many ways to do that. And then obviously you just see what happens. But the great thing about using any sort of deep end approach is that you give them the opportunity to activate what they already know at the beginning. And then that kind of guides you into what you're doing later. So I think you can still follow your plan, but if you have that activity at the beginning, which encourages them to demonstrate what they already know, that can make a big difference. And I think that's what I would suggest to a lot of teachers. Just experiment with it. See how it goes. See how it goes with trying the production task first if you're using that PPP model.
Yeah, I think a lot of teachers can get quite overwhelmed when you suggest something not only new, but that is so different and possibly in their mind going against what they think they should do. But I would say just jump in and try, because at the end of the day, even if your lesson bombs, so what? It's all a learning experience. And then you can just reflect. You know, we ask our students to reflect, don't we? What did you learn this week? So if we do the same thing, you know, you can tweak it, you can refine it, you can do a bit more reading, you know, but you just try something.
Yeah, exactly. And I think when you said, the lesson bombed, I think this is almost a hangover from a lot of teacher training courses. You know, I work on Trinity TESOL course and I've been training teachers for about 13, 14 years. And it's all about the lesson aims and the lesson outcomes. So the teachers think, if I don't manage to get them doing that at the end, it's a failure. Now, as experienced teachers, we know that first of all, students are different. Some may get it, some won't. Some will be more confident, less competent, more competent by the end of the lesson. But it's an ongoing thing. And we don't teach these separate lessons, distinct lessons, basically. So if you think a lesson bombed, it probably didn't bomb. It just means you might have the opportunity to cover it again or to go over it in a bit more detail in the next lesson. So that also, I think, helps thinking, well, we don't have to think of these lessons just as one-off events. It's ongoing.
Absolutely.
There's so much recycling we need to do as teachers and they need to do as learners.
That's it. You can't just do something and go on to the next thing. There has to be one step back, two steps forward, one step back, two steps forward. I was at a conference at the weekend and previously I heard this fact that we forget 80% of everything we learn in 24 hours. But apparently it's more like we forget almost everything immediately. Which doesn't bode well. But I completely get that, being in my 40s. But yeah, if you think about it like that, you know, you have to find time and space to review. And, you know, speaking of that, once you have all this, shall we call it student generated content, you know, everything's coming from them. What do you do to reuse, reintroduce, recycle and practice all of that lovely language that you've sort of taken from them and elevated for them?
Yeah, I mean, there are just so many things we can do. And teachers obviously have lots of different techniques and activities up their sleeve. I mean, that's one thing I think we should do as teachers. If we can collect activities, that's great. I like the idea of mini tasks. So we talk about task-based language teaching and we think, okay, I'm going to do this task. It's quite a complex task. It's going to take 25 minutes, 30 minutes. But our students spend hours and hours and hours in the classroom. They become very familiar with doing certain tasks. So one thing I thought of a while ago was I created using ChatGPT this mini task prompt generator, and I used it with Jane and David Willis's category of 6 different types of tasks. So that's like listing tasks, ordering tasks, comparing tasks, problem solving, sharing personal experiences, creative tasks. And so it could be, let's say a word comes up like rich and wealthy. So, okay, you want them to use the word wealthy. So you think, okay, in your pairs, think of 5 ways your life would be different if you were suddenly wealthy. So you very quickly just create a quick 5-minute communicative task.
I love that.
And just by just noting down all these these 6 tasks give us so much flexibility. And the more confident I think you become as a teacher and the more experienced, you realize that you can just think of these off the top of your head. But if you don't, then you just have a list of these tasks in front of you, and then that will just help. Or listing, you've suddenly become wealthy. What are the first 5 things you're going to buy? And naturally, they're going to use that language, and they're going to associate that language with their own life, and it's going to be personalized to them. And, teachers are I think we're exposed to so many of these tasks from using course books that we can just really simplify them and adapt them.
Yeah, I love that. It's so simple, which is what we need, and it's sort of low to no prep, which I'm all for.
Absolutely.
Personalizing is such a big thing, and stuff like that. They're interesting questions. Everyone's interested in that.
Yeah.
And that forming those connections in the brain is such an essential part of learning and retaining the language. And then, like you say, I think that if you're I always say to teachers, trust your skills. So what I mean is, don't plan down to the last minute, but also don't spend hours looking for things online. If you just go with the flow, I think your brain, I do that in my lessons. I plan sort of minimally, and then in the middle of a lesson, I'll be like, oh, that's a good idea. And then suddenly we'll go off and do a little activity, and it just flows so much better, and everyone's having a good time. And then you can pat yourself on the back and go, God, that was genius. Well done.
Yeah. And I mean, related to that, I think one thing that teachers can do is just think, okay, you don't have to fill 60 minutes with lots of activities. This is one of the things I think is wrong with most initial teacher training courses, where we're thinking this activity will last 2 minutes. Then we'll move on to this, which will last 4 minutes. And then there'll be a 3.5 minute. And it never, ever works out like that.
Never. I don't bother putting timing on my lessons anymore. No. I just I put a few things down. I go, right, we'll see what happens. And then just see what happens.
Exactly.
It's just more relaxing, isn't it? It's more fun for everyone.
Yeah. And I think when we think about students becoming more proficient, being proficient, part of it is that you're able to interact spontaneously and communicate spontaneously with these kind of unplanned things that happen in your life. So just learning these grammar rules, for example, or vocabulary for a particular situation, it's not going to be that helpful when they're in the wild, having to use language. So anything that can encourage them to actually get comfortable with the unexpected, I think is really useful.
Yeah. And for you too,
Yeah,
absolutely. I think, there are a few little things teaching is for me. One of them is stealing ideas and adapting. And the other, because, you don't have that many original ideas, do you? Yeah. Steal and adapt, but winging it as well. Learn to react in the moment, and don't worry if your plan goes off kilter, who cares? Especially if the students are engaged, just let it flow and see what happens.
Absolutely. I mean, one of the best piece of advice I've ever got was from my DOS about 20 years ago. And he said, your learners are your best resource. And that I think is at the heart of Dogma or Teaching Unplugged. It's that basically everything you need is there. It's you, your learners, and the interaction between you and your learners, and the interaction between the learners. And everything is there that you need for a lesson, basically.
Yeah, I think on top of that, though, there's definitely that sort of forming the relationship stage, because if you're going to engage them, you have to know what they're into and what they're going to respond to as well, I think.
Yeah, and that's a perfect unplug lesson where you just say, okay, you can write on the board, these are things I like, these are things I don't like. Now you think of things you like, things of things you don't like, then go around mingling, find out what you have in common with your colleagues, with your classmates. And that could be a class survey. The class likes this, but in general, the class doesn't like this. But then you can also move on to other things as well. You could move on to, has that changed? What did you used to like when you were young? So, there are so many different ways these very simple, basic kind of everyday tasks can just expand.
Oh, I'm learning so much. I feel like jumping on ChatGPT immediately and generating a bunch of different activities. But it's so good, isn't it? It's just, I love it. I really love it. Now, you and I probably have the luxury of slightly longer lessons. What would you say, like, is there any time and space for this approach in a mainstream, say, secondary school class with limited time, possible restrictions? I mean, I did some observations last year in a school in French Guiana, and they have 55 minutes twice a week, and teachers are struggling to get what they need to get across. But do you think they could employ a little bit of dogme here, bearing in mind a lot of the students aren't very keen to speak or their level is extremely low?
Yeah, it is difficult, isn't it? I mean, one approach is the flipped classroom, but that won't necessarily work in a lot of contexts, will it?
No, they generally don't do homework, I found.
Yeah. So, I mean, one thing I think often in mainstream education, you have, for example, lots of examples. You have maybe 10 sentences they've got to transform from the present to the past. So how could you share that out with your learners? Rather than getting them all to do 10, maybe give each learner one sentence if you've got 10 learners, for example, and then getting them to share that. And that means there is a bit more of a communicative aspect to that as well.
If they speak English.
If they speak. Yeah. I mean, that's the challenge, isn't it? I mean, we know that learners need a lot of input, and then, they used to call it the silent way, which, obviously where they're exposed to a lot of language, and then when they feel comfortable, they start to speak. And that's where techniques which have fallen out of fashion sometimes come back in, don't they? Things like drilling, which I'm a big fan of drilling, actually. Just because I think it really helps with confidence building for a lot of learners. They're not put on the spot. They're speaking. It's not natural speaking, but at least they're exercising the vocal muscles.
Yeah, and it can be fun, especially if you've got a phrase and you do some back chaining or something like that. They love that. They absolutely love that. But I do think the key also is, and we are digressing a bit, but hey, let it flow.
That's dogma.
Again, it's about building relationships and creating that environment where your students feel comfortable enough and confident enough to actually speak without fear of making a fool of themselves or saying something wrong or something like that. And it's very easy for me to say that. Sometimes it takes a very long time. But I think that with dogma, with building your students' confidence, anything, and I keep saying this in all my podcasts, everything is a process. And I think teachers very much want a quick fix, and I don't blame them. Especially if you're like a mainstream school teacher, you've got so much pressure coming down on you. But I think a dose of reality is needed here. Like, it doesn't happen that way. But if you are willing just to take a little step outside your comfort zone and try just something very small, see how it goes, and then build on it. And then that might also make you empathize with what your students are going through as well, in terms of like what you're expecting from them.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, people talk about things like speaking classes and conversation classes. Now, at a low level, a 30-minute conversation class is an enormous amount of time. So why not think, okay, let's have a 3-minute conversation class. Okay, just give them 3 minutes just to try to speak. Take the pressure off. Start with these kind of achievable little goals and see if that works.
Yeah, absolutely. Small steps every time.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Okay. All right, Dylan, thank you so much for your time. I really, really enjoyed this conversation, and I really do think that my listeners are going to get a lot out of it. So once again, guys, I would encourage you just to try something very small from this. Go on ChatGPT, generate a task list of some little mini tasks, see how you go, and let us know as well. Thank you so much, Dylan.
Great. I've had a great time speaking to you about all these things. And yes, I completely echo what you said. I just think take baby steps, experiment. If it doesn't work out, it doesn't work out. It's not the end of the world. You'll learn something from it anyway, I think.
Exactly. Thank you so much, Dylan. I think we've all learnt something from this episode. So, my challenge to you, my darling, gorgeous teacher, is just take something small from this episode, something that appeals to you, resonates with you, something you think, I can do this. Just something really small, and take that little step and try it out in your class this week and let me know how it goes. My email is erin@refreshyourteaching.com. Yes, it's changed. It's also in the show notes. I am officially open for business. Use the email if you want to contact me. You can also join my newsletter community. I am cutting down to once a month with my newsletters for reasons of sort of changing my focus and things like that. But I want you to know, if you're already in my newsletter group, if you want to join the community, I'm always there at the end of the keyboard. Can I say that? If you want a question answered, if you have a comment about anything, if you need some support or advice, I am there. And also, if you or your institution want to work with me, my email address is, one more time, erin@refreshyourteaching.com. I'm offering tailor-made CPD sessions for schools and institutions. So if you have identified an issue that your teachers have, I can help you overcome that with something very small, step by step, a couple of key concepts, going deep, and then offering ways to practically implement that into class. I'm very excited. I'd love to work with you. So until next time, look after yourself, have a peaceful couple of weeks, and share the love. Bye. Thank you so much for listening. This podcast is free and always will be, so if you feel like giving something back, you can do one of the following. You can subscribe to the podcast on your preferred platform, spare a few minutes and write me a 5-star review on Apple or Spotify, follow Everything EFL on Instagram, Facebook or Twitter, and engage with me and my followers. If you would like to contact me, my email is in the show notes. Finally, and most importantly, share this episode on social media and tell your colleagues. Share the love. Bye.